Willgoose, Esquire, Public Service Broadcasting. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, also in the band is Wrigglesworth and J.F. Abraham. Did J.F. not get the memo that everyone has to sound like they've come out of a P.G. Wodehouse novel?
The only memo we gave him actually was that he couldn't follow. We all had to have differently formatted names. So mine is initial and a surname and a qualifying suffix. Wrigglesworth is like Pele, he's only got one name. And J.F. Abraham, he went with two initials and a surname. So they do it. I think it's supposed to run on all as one though, so it does have a slight air of eccentricity to it, maybe.
A slight air?
Yeah.
I mean, one wouldn't want more than a slight air of eccentricity with public service broadcasting.
Absolutely not. You don't want to overdo these things.
No, certainly not. I discovered you with The Race for Space, which seemed like, initially it seemed like an electronic album, but like early spacecrafts and rockets, it had human frailties built into it. How important is it in the music to blur the line between man, machine, analog, digital?
Well, I think that's definitely something we played around with Progress, which was sort of the first single off the new album, which was kind of, that's a song about automation and about machines kind of taking over from humans, but humans still being in control of machines. So you've got all kinds of more natural elements like guitars and drums and bass kind of being taken over slightly in the second verse by vocoder and synth parts, and then all meshing together for kind of the end. And I think that's kind of, that song in miniature is kind of what we do, I suppose. It's blending all these different elements together, and where it does get electronic, making sure it does still have some kind of organic element to it so that it's not too sort of clinical, I suppose, and perfect. Whenever I play on anything, it's guaranteed to be imperfect anyway, so as long as I'm doing something on it, it will have that element of kind of human error.
But when you began in 2009, you set out with the intention to make it clear that there was a human element to it, to differentiate the programmed from the human.
Yeah, and it was difficult then because it was a solo thing when it started out, and it was just me and some sort of MIDI controllers and a guitar and a banjo, and I'd hop around between a lot of them, and there wasn't actually any video element when it first started as well. So really, I made the show what I would want to see if I was watching that kind of thing. So when I go and see electronic artists, no matter how good the lights are, no matter how good the sound is, I get very frustrated if it's just man or woman checking emails on stage and, turning some knobs, and, it's just very musically unengaging. So I wanted to make sure there was always something that you could see was happening on stage, and you could tell where these sounds were coming from, at least some of them. Even as a three-piece, we do have to use some backing elements, especially touring abroad, where we can't afford to take a full brass section or similar. So there is always, again, that sort of balance between man and machine, but it's kind of free enough and loose enough that it is definitely live, and definitely has enough capacity for error to make it kind of a different experience each night.
The most recent album, Every Valley. Now, Space Race has excitement, and fear of death, and technology, but in theory, an album about the Welsh valleys and the death of communities, or the death of an industry around a community, sounds pretty dry. Was that one of the inspirational bits of that to take something that is in theory quite dry and make it story and entertainment?
I think so, yeah. I think it's that kind of slightly perverse desire to make things difficult for yourself. I think you're more likely to make something that's worth making if you're kind of challenging yourself, and certainly, writing an album that's trying to tell this story of the demise of coal mining, from sort of the more glory days, relatively speaking. Not sure it was ever a particularly glorious industry to be involved with, but from that to, the industry's kind of very deliberate dismantling, it's not an obvious choice for a subject matter for any album, much less an album that kind of has aspirations to be broadly appealing, I suppose. Yeah, and I liked the appeal of that, and I liked the chance to kind of play with people's expectations of where we would go after having done an album like The Race for Space. So I don't think many people I don't think anybody guessed what we would have done.
No.
So
Well, I certainly didn't.
yeah,
Um,
I like that.
but, or in truth, did you just want to get a Welsh male choir on
Well,
an
that
album?
was appealing, you know, the chance to work with a choir and the outside chance, it seemed to me, to get James Dean Bradfield on board. You know, there were certain elements that drew me towards South Wales more than, say, basing it in the northeast or in Yorkshire or you know, near Glasgow, any of the other kind of really traditional coal mining strongholds. That's that, and the kind of the geography of the area and the strength of the community during the strike. It was the area that had fewest returners to work. You know, all these things kind of just drew me sort of almost like a magnet down that way. And it kind of all actually came out. It went to plan, really, which records normally don't. But we're very lucky with this one.
A lot of women weren't as fortunate as me. They weren't taught to wire a plug, they were taught to make a sponge. They weren't taught how to change the wheel on the car. They were taught the proper way to iron a white shirt.
It does take up the line from your the first album, which I know you don't say, but it is in the theme, really, that together they say something about the spirit of our time. In the spirit of our time in this album is quite defined in the sense that it's relatively immediate past. But do your albums tell us something about our time now in our listening to them?
Well, that's always my intention, because otherwise it would be an exercise in nostalgia, really, as much as anything, which it just holds no appeal for me. I mean, I know that might sound strange for somebody who's kind of made this weird career of playing music to black and white videos in the background, but you know, nostalgia is not something that I find appealing or attractive. It's recontextualizing these images and this material into the present and using very modern technologies to present them and modern techniques to play them on stage. That it's, you know, without wanting to get too pretentious, that is kind of the definition of postmodernism, really. To me, it's kind of taking something old and building something new on top of it. It's kind of like what Ridley Scott did with Blade Runner or something like that. I wouldn't ever put what we do up with one of the absolute masterworks of cinema, but that's the interesting bit of it to me. It's these little parallels and lines and contrasts and sort of juxtapositions that you get when you are working with old material but in a present day context.
Without wanting to get too pretentious, you must know that's some people would make that criticism of you, particularly English telling a Welsh story and a Welsh working class story at that. Are you comfortable with that, and with the assumption that it would be pretentious?
Well, I think that's moving away from pretension so much and into more, these ideas of cultural appropriation, which are. I certainly agree with that preoccupation to some extent, but I don't agree that you necessarily need to be personally involved in a story to tell it. I think that would be an incredibly limiting thing for art in general to adopt as a kind of way of working. So I think really the thing that you need to have and that we've had throughout is kind of respect for the material that you're working with. And in the early days with some of the more kitsch stuff, that respect was a total lack of respect because it didn't deserve it. But when you're working with a more serious subject like this, if we'd written it from London, done it remotely, not spoken to anybody, not got involved in actually meeting some of the people whose stories these were, I could see that we would open ourselves up to, legitimate criticism in that manner. But we met ex-miners, we interviewed people in the community, we recorded it in the heart of these communities. We spent a great deal of time researching in the area. And we went back there to launch the album. We've kind of still been involved in ongoing ways of trying to give back to the community that helped us and supported us. So I have an extremely clear conscience on that, which I have that's very rare for me to have an extremely clear conscience on anything. But I think it's easy to kind of lazily dismiss something from that point of view. But if sincere and genuine efforts have been made to address that, then I don't think it's particularly legitimate. And more to the point, if you're coming to it from outside, I think you do bring a kind of fresh perspective and you do bring a kind of almost a naivety that people who are involved in this and whose lives this is kind of encompassed and been absorbed by, they don't necessarily have that, and you do have the chance to bring something fresh to it. So I think it's a perfectly valid way of working as long as you do it with respect for the material and the people whose stories that you're telling.
Yeah. And you are quite literally using their voices
Yeah.
to tell the story.
Yeah, it's not something we've kind of stamped our own opinions or our own voices all over. There's a few lyrics that we did write for the album, but even those are very kind of, they're written with the subject in mind, and they're not making it, it's not an album about us, certainly. Yeah.
One of the other differences, the album, I mean, it sounds like, particularly comparing it with The Race for Space, I mean, it sounds like Gagarin and Go had the thrust of the dance floor, but there's more of a meditative feel to every valley. Is there any connection to the fact that The Race for Space has a voice at the beginning, says this is a new era for mankind, but Every Valley is about the end of an era?
I think, yeah, I mean, it's not something that was necessarily consciously thought about. I think Progress is the kind of most accessible and poppy thing on there as a kind of, the way into the album for to try and give it that kind of appeal that it might not otherwise have. But it's a sad story, and there's no getting away from that. I think what this album ended up being, and what I didn't realise it was going to be at the time, but it's still about progress, and it is progress for humanity that we're moving away from dirty energy, and that people in industrial, previously in post-industrial, I suppose, countries aren't having to work these extremely dangerous and dirty jobs and getting a week's holiday a year and all the sort of the downsides of working in that industry. That's all a good thing, but it's at the same time some people and some communities have been left behind by the wider progress for humanity. And it's about looking at that and asking some questions about that and their kind of plight, I suppose, and where that leaves us as a society today.
Russian novelists usually only appear in Sting songs or maybe Velvet Underground.
Okay, right.
But then chaps called Willgoose and Wrigglesworth generally only appear in Edwardian novels, comic novels, and Richard Burton generally appears only on prog concept albums in the 70s. Yeah. How does this all fit in with what I assume was a mission statement in the title of your first album, to inform, educate, and entertain?
Well, I think what you see, certainly with some elements of our presentation, for example, my onstage moniker and Wrigglesworth is possibly people who weren't taking that seriously at the start and thought they were being funny, and now realising that they've very much made a rod for their own back, and what they think is funny isn't necessarily. So there's that kind of thing running through it. I think it started off much more tongue-in-cheek than it has turned into, and hopefully it has kept a kind of sense of that playfulness and that lack of pretension about doing quite a pretentious thing. It wasn't ever intended to be this kind of very haughty and sort of lecturing. These are things that you ought to know about, because I would hope I'd never be so arrogant as to treat an audience as if they didn't know anything about it in the first place, and that we were the ones with the wisdom to dispense. It was kind of it was almost informed by some elements of sort of hip hop and some sort of hyping yourself up and sort of the mythology that some bands and some artists create around themselves. Like the Beastie Boys and even people like Bowie. It was kind of an attempt to kind of start building your own very tongue-in-cheek kind of mythos, I suppose. And it's followed us a bit more than I thought it might have. Especially, I wrote a line for the Edinburgh Fringe in 2010 saying we were teaching the lessons of the past through the music of the future. I mean, that's such a joke. I mean, that was never intended as serious, but the number of interviews it comes up in, the number of people who say it quite seriously back at you, it's just a warning to, what seems like a clever and funny line at the time might well come back to bite you.
Well, I think people have to remember the third part of that they're entertained.
Yeah,
company.
That was the focus, especially of the first album. It's like, we're not really informing or educating anybody, let's be honest. This is about entertainment, but we can try and pretend like, public service broadcasting, even calling our band that is an attempt to say, like, what we're doing is incredibly important, don't you know? But it's not, and we know that, but I think it's easy to see how that could come off. If you didn't give us the benefit of the doubt, how that could come off in the wrong way. But
Well, look, I certainly believe that any time a tall Englishman in a bow tie is talking to me, I'm going to be educated. So.
well, I certainly wouldn't go along with that. No, no, I would advise you against that preconception, misconception even.
Well, I'm going to cling to it. It's important to me.
Fine. Okay.
J Willgoose Esquire, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.